Title: What Really Happened to the Irish Elk? Stories for Sleep. The world was still young in its dreaming when the first hush drifted across the northern plain. Dawn had not yet unclasped her silver bracelets from the wide horizon, and night lingered in a blue-black hush so deep it seemed a second ocean, weightless and without tide. In that near-starless dark, the land itself breathed. Slow, cavernous exhalations rising from peat-rich valleys, curling in faint white ribbons that wove through birch stands like wandering spirits seeking their own names. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what's the time there. Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for being the part of my community. Let's get started. Frost jeweled every blade of grass, every lichen-draped stone, every half-hidden root that clutched at the deep, cold earth, and each tiny crystal sang silently of distance and time, of winters uncounted, of summers yet unborn. The air tasted of iron and pine resin and something older still. A metallic sweetness carried from the glacier's far edge, where sheets of ancient ice groaned as they inched their ponderous way toward the waiting sea. No hoof had pressed this ground tonight. No warm body had broken the hush with breath or heartbeat, or the soft rustle of fur against fur. But the earth remembered, even in silence. It remembered the gruff bark of aurochs, the muttered warnings of cave bears, the bone-dry whisper of woolly grasses bending beneath the midnight wind. And now, as the last constellations blinked out against the blanching sky, the world sensed the subtle flutter of something becoming, an unseen stirring, a promise of movement not yet made. A pale blush dulled the darkness at the rim of the east. It crept slowly, as if uncertain whether it was welcome, and the night gave ground in gentle retreat. Mist gathered confidence in the faint light, thickening into low-gliding sheets that hugged the hollows and drifted above stone-scattered ridges. All else held its breath. Even the black-throated diver on the distant lake fell mute beneath the spell of that waking hush, its crimson eye catching the first splinter of dawn like a coal banked in water. Then, almost imperceptible at first, came a sound, the pliant crumple of frosted grass under weight, a single step after an age of stillness. It was not hurried and bore no hint of fear. Rather, it was the measured tread of something vast yet gentle, something that carried the implacable patience of seasons in its sinew. Another step followed, and another, until the plains themselves seemed to beat in quiet rhythm, earth and traveler moving as one enormous heart. Across a shallow rise the figure emerged, slowly, as though carved from the very air. In the wan light the creature appeared more shadow than flesh. High withers, tapered legs, coat the color of winter earth wrapped in pale mist. There were no antlers, not yet. The brow was smooth, the crown bare, but the promise of future grandeur lay hidden beneath skin and bone, waiting like a seed beneath permafrost. Tall ears swiveled toward every faint crack of ice, every sigh of wind among the reeds. Eyes deep as the midnight sky flickered with watchful wonder. This was the first of his kind to step upon this valley in many winters. A young bull, though still shy of the titanic majesty that would one day define him. He carried the long, sturdy frame of his lineage, shoulders broad and sloped to a slender flank, limbs built for endless wandering, hooves splayed for marsh and grassland alike. And in his warm breath, curling soft as milk in the cold air, lived the memory of generations who had crossed these plains when even the rivers dreamed beneath ice, when mammoths lumbered in dark processions across the far horizon, and when nights unrolled like velvet unmarked by flame or drum. He moved alone now, yet he was never truly solitary. The ghosts of his herd lingered in the hush between heartbeats, in the faint scent of aged moss pressed by vanished bodies, in the shape of distant trails carved through sedge and fern. He followed those spirit roads by instinct, shoulders brushing aside the hanging mist, each footfall laying a quiet verse atop a buried song. Not once did he pause to question the way. He carried the way within him, woven through marrow and memory alike. Behind him, the sky brightened to the pale rose of thinned blood, and the young bull's shadow stretched long across frost-bitten earth. He turned toward that growing light, muzzle lifting, nostrils widening for the scent of distant water. A lake lay beyond the rise. He could taste it in the air, tangy with loam and reed and faint mineral bite. His throat ached softly with thirst, but he did not hurry. The stillness of dawn was sacred, and he moved as though afraid to break it open too quickly, lest some fragile thread of belonging snap and send the world spinning away. A white owl passed overhead in noiseless flight, wings beating the sky like slow heartbeats. Its round face turned to regard the bull below. Two creatures sharing this suspended moment on either side of dawn. For an instant, time seemed to drift sideways, each second slipping off its axis, and the owl's gaze conveyed an ancient greeting, neither predator nor prey, but somewhere older than both. The bull dipped his head, ears flickering. In that silent exchange hung the entire history of the land, equal parts wonder, caution, and abiding respect. When at last the sun's rim peaked above the far tree line, light fell in liquid sheets across the plain. Frost crystals shattered into sudden diamonds, and the mist flared pearl before collapsing into rivulets of chilled dew racing toward low ground. Color spilled back into the world. Subtle greens of moss and sedge, the pale russet of last summer's grass flattened but unbroken, the subdued gold of lichen crusting granite outcrops. The bull stepped onto a granite shelf, hooves clicking softly, and surveyed the glimmering valley below. The lake lay smooth as a mirror, unbroken save for concentric ripples, where a lone beaver hauled a birch branch toward its half-frozen lodge. Beyond the water, birch trunks clustered like ivory flutes rising in concert, their branches nodding in breeze too faint to feel. And farther still, the land lifted again into heath and scrub, then into low hills tufted with dwarf pine where hares would soon etch quicksilver tracks across new snow. The young bull breathed deep, letting the scene imprint itself upon him the way stars imprint upon dark water, as reflection, as promise, as quiet testament. Here, beneath the soft roar of dawn, he felt the sudden certainty that he belonged to this wide hush as surely as his breath belonged to his lungs. The plain, the lake, the glittering frost. They were each a chamber in the cathedral of earth, and he was both pilgrim and living hymn. He lowered his head, pressed his muzzle to the stone, and tasted its mineral cold. A benediction, a memory older than bone. When thirst finally nudged him from reverie, he descended the slope in patient strides. Frost-rimmed grasses brushed his knees, releasing faint, sweet scents preserved in ice. Tiny voles darted beneath their brittle shelter, scarcely stirring the blades. He ignored them, eyes fixed upon the silver thread of a stream snaking from lake to plain. Its banks were encrusted with hoarfrost thick as fur, but water whispered beneath, clear and unstoppable. He stepped carefully down, lowering his muzzle to drink. Water kissed his tongue like melted starlight, shockingly cold, shockingly alive. As he drank, his ears kept constant vigil, swiveling at every creak of distant ice. Across the lake, something stirred among the birches, too tall for wolf, too silent for boar. The bull lifted his head, droplets falling bright from whiskered chin. A pair of reindeer emerged, their lighter frames ghost pale against shadowed trunks. They paused, assessing the lone figure at water's edge. Satisfied, they moved on, hooves muffled by moss. For a moment he considered calling to them, some low rumble of greeting, but the instinct faded. Their world was not his. They would travel south when snow came in earnest. He would drift east where grass still whispered beneath shallow drifts. Paths might cross, destinies rarely merged. Above, the sun climbed beyond tree line, each minute drawing the promise of warmth. The bull felt its fingers on his dark pelt, touched the first amber gleam lighting the fine hairs along shoulder and flank. He stood a while longer, savoring heat that would soon retreat again when afternoon clouds rolled eastward. Already, vapor curled from his nostrils in slow plumes, catching flame in the sun before vanishing like thoughts unspoken. He turned north, guided by nothing so crude as map or route, but by the subtle suggestion of wind across whisker, by the barometric murmur hidden in his blood, and by an ancestral pull that said, the great herds once gathered beyond that far ridge. Perhaps they gathered still, perhaps only memory lingered. But he must go because going was written into the marrow of his bones as surely as ice was written into the heart of winter. He climbed from the stream bed, water droplets catching light along his legs like beads of polished amber. As he walked, the land slowly unfurled. Knolls rose and fell in quiet cadence, their slopes veiled with fragile frost flowers that fluttered at his passing. On one ridge he paused, gazing west where snow clouds massed above the low hills, heavy, slate-colored shapes pregnant with silence. They would come by dusk, he knew, blanketing the plain in white hush. And he would welcome them, for winter was not enemy but elder, strict yet generous, carving weakness from flesh and leaving only what could endure. The bull followed the crest northward, each step sinking into lichen and thin soil. Beneath his hooves, stones whispered histories, a million footfalls, antlers clashing, mothers calling calves home through storm. Sometimes he thought he could almost distinguish words in those cracked echoes, some half-remembered language of hoof and wind and antler strike. But whenever he tried to listen too closely, sound dissolved into mere breeze, as though the past itself played shy, refusing to name itself outright. Beyond the ridge, the terrain fell away into a broad basin, strewn with erratic boulders dropped by retreating ice. Here grew vast fans of golden sedge and waist-high fescue browned by frost. The bull paused, lowering his head to tear at the brittle stalks. Though dry, they carried a faint sweetness, sunlight remembered in straw. He chewed slowly, savoring each mouthful. Food was abundant for now, but his body understood hunger would come, and each caloric memory mattered. While he fed, a faint rumble trembled through the ground. He froze, ears erect. Far away, beyond the basin's rim, heavy footfalls answered one another. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound rode the bones of the earth, familiar yet thrilling. He lifted his head high, nostrils wide. A breeze carried across the basin, laden with rich musk, elk, his own kind. A pulse leapt through his veins. He had been alone for moon cycles beyond counting, wandering trustfully, yet yearning for voices shaped like his. Now, at last, the world answered. He raised his muzzle to the pale sky and released a low call, soft, uncertain, but resonant through chest and belly. It rolled across the frost-blanched grass like distant thunder. Silence answered first, stretched long enough for doubt to peer through. Then came an echoing note, deeper, seasoned, sure, and another, higher, younger, hopeful. A chorus forming on invisible lips. The bull's heart hammered a slow drum against ribs. He moved again, trot lengthening unconsciously. Each breath steadied, but energy coiled within him, ready to spring. It was not yet spring rut. There were no antlers to clash, no rivals to contest. Still, the call of kinship surged louder than hunger, louder than caution. In every winter, warmth is not merely fire, but company. And so he went, forging a narrow trail through sedge that hissed around his flanks like whispers of welcome. As he neared the basin's far rim, the air thickened with scent. Resin of pine, musk of elk, the faint sour reek of old pelts. His pulse steadied into a solemn beat, synchronizing with hoof thuds ahead. Then, cresting a low hummock, he saw them. A small aggregation, 5 perhaps, drifting among willows at the edge of a half-frozen marsh. 2 cows, steady-eyed and patient. A yearling bull, antler nubs velvet-wrapped like pale candle flames. And the patriarch, a broad-chested elder whose crowns of bone had shattered and shed seasons ago, leaving only scarred pedicles upon a noble brow. They turned as one at his approach, ears forward, bodies poised for flight, yet not fleeing. He slowed, lowering his head, offering stillness. Silence pooled. Breath clouded between them, mingling like offerings on cold altar. Eyes, amber, sable, twig-brown, searched across space neither short nor long but sacred. The cows blinked first, necks relaxing. The yearling tossed his head with youthful relish, sending a puff of frost swirling. The patriarch stepped forward, hooves sinking deep, and exhaled a rumble that seemed to vibrate the morning itself. Welcome, measured and weighty. The young bull exhaled in turn, chest loosening. He closed the final space at a respectful pace, feeling as though he crossed not meters but lifetimes. When he reached them, the cows extended muzzles, inhaling his scent near throat and shoulder. He returned the courtesy, breathing the wildflower undertones of their fur, the cedar of their hides. No barrier rose. The old bull inclined his head, and the union was sealed. Without fanfare, they turned together toward the west, hooves beating a new rhythm drawn from 6 hearts, now braided into one living strand. They moved as a small, quiet constellation across the basin, each member mindful of the other's space, yet comforted by that nearness. The young bull found himself beside the yearling, whose bright eyes darted from sky to snow clouds, as though cataloging wonders to share later. The cows walked abreast, bodies swaying in patient harmony. At the rear strode the patriarch, guardianship incarnate, his scarred brow lifted to horizon as if reading omens in wind. By midday, the thin sun skimmed zenith. Its light filtered through milk-white cloud banks. Snow drifted down in soft motes that melted on warm hides, leaving star-shaped imprints upon fur. With each flake a hush deepened, but it was not the hush of solitude. It was the hush of shared breath, of hearts beating beneath muted sky. They stopped to graze, tearing up mats of sedge hidden beneath new powder, and the young bull marveled at how even the simplest act felt transformed when performed in company. Each chew a conversation, each swallowed stalk a vow of endurance whispered from one gut to another. Evening drew in with sudden brevity, as winter evenings do. Shadows stretched spidery and long, merging until ground and sky became a single violet page. The herd found shelter in a small copse of bent pines whose branches rustled like low lullabies. Snow drifted deeper, clothing the earth in weightless quilts. Hunger eased, eyelids drooped. They settled in a broad semicircle, bodies angled against wind's mild scrape. The young bull pressed flank to earth, still faintly warm beneath snow, and for the first time in many nights, sleep flirted without caution. Yet before surrendering to dreams, he lifted his gaze eastward, across a plain now glazed silver beneath a waxing moon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, calves would be born when spring hammered its soft gold nails into the world. Somewhere, torrents of meltwater would thunder, and new grass would pierce softened soil. Somewhere, antlers would surge through skin, urged by the inexorable commands of daylight and blood. The future lay coiled like a fern fiddle beneath snow, waiting for warmth to unfurl it. And he would meet it step for step, breath for breath. Moonlight glinted off his smooth brow, unbroken save for the faintest ridges where antler buds slept beneath flesh. He touched one budding pedicle with the tip of his hoof, feeling its promise throb against a cold air. "Not yet," the land whispered. "Wait, grow. The world is patient, and so must you be." He exhaled, the cloud of breath silver against the night, and lowered his head upon folded forelegs. Wind murmured through pine boughs, snow settled in featherweight sighs, and the heartbeat of the herd pulsed a gentle chorus into the darkness. The young bull closed his eyes, drifting downward through layers of hush, carried upon the soft tide that bore all living things toward their own timeless center. Far above, stars burned holes in heaven's fabric, each spark a witness, each witness a vow that nothing, no hoofprint, no breath, no gentle closing of eyelids, was ever truly lost. All was gathered, remembered, and set in place like beads upon an unending string. And so he slept, afloat in that boundless remembering, already dreaming of thawing rivers, of grass tasting like sunlight, of the velvet crown that would one day rise from his brow in sweeping arcs to kiss the sky. The night before she came into the world was the kind of cold that made even the pines seem to hold their breath. The moon, thin and silver-edged, hung over the plain like a shard of polished ice, throwing pale light across snow that had settled in drifts deeper than a grown elk's chest. The herd had found shelter along the lee of a low, rocky rise, where wind hissed above, but could not pierce the hollow they'd claimed. There, in the quiet glow of moon and frost, a cow lay in the thick bedding of flattened sedge, her breath rising in clouds, her body taut with the ancient labor of beginnings. Around her, the others stood sentinel. The old bull at the rear kept his head turned to the wind, nostrils flaring for the scent of wolf or man. The yearling shifted restlessly, testing the frozen ground with impatient hooves, though his eyes often flicked toward the cow with something like curiosity. The two older females stood close, their flanks touching hers, their warmth a silent reassurance that no birth in this herd happened alone. Even the young bull who had joined them only moons ago, still without antlers, still learning the rhythms of their shared life, stood watch, his breath a white pillar in the dim light. Snow whispered against stone. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a night bird gave a low, mournful call, then fell silent again. The cow's sides tightened, then released, her breath deepening. It was not a sound of pain, only of effort, a low, rhythmic push that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The others shifted in subtle unison, their bodies forming a wall against the cold, their steady presence as much a part of the birthing as the cow's own labor. Then, in the hush between one breath and the next, it happened. A movement beneath her tail, a sudden glistening shape meeting the night air. First, the dark curve of a head, ears folded close, muzzle slick with the warmth of another world. Shoulders followed, then the length of a narrow body, legs ungainly and long. The calf slid gently into the bedding of crushed sedge and snow, steaming faintly in the frigid light. The mother bent to lick her newborn, each stroke of her tongue brisk and deliberate, as though she could polish the calf into life itself. Steam rose where her warm breath touched damp fur, and the faint scent of newness, of milk, of blood, of first breath, wove into the cold, clean air. The calf blinked against the moonlight, eyes wide and dark, filled with the bewilderment of one who has never before seen a sky. For long moments she lay still, legs folded awkwardly beneath her. The old bull grunted once, low and approving. The yearling took a step closer, nostrils twitching to catch the scent of her, then stepped back again, as if realizing some sacred boundary was not yet his to cross. The young bull, watching from the shadow of the rock, felt something stir inside him. A quiet recognition, a memory of his own first sight of moonlight on snow. The calf moved. First, a trembling of her narrow shoulders, then a slow, uncertain shift of weight. Her legs unfolded like the delicate architecture of a reed bending in wind. She lifted her head, ears flicking as she found the scent of her mother's milk. But before hunger, there was the first trial: to stand. She tried once, slid on the packed sedge and sank again with a soft thump. The mother nuzzled her flank, patient. The second time, the legs wobbled beneath her but held. The third, she took her first step, awkward, unsure, yet carrying her closer to the curve of her mother's belly. When she found the teat, she drank as though the cold and hunger of the whole wide plain had been waiting inside her. Milk, warm as summer, filled her mouth, and the world seemed to steady around her. The mother stood over her, eyes half closed in quiet triumph. Dawn came slowly. The frostlight that had given the night its name deepened into a blue so pure it seemed to hum. The eastern horizon glowed faintly pink, then gold, and each snow crystal caught the light, throwing it back in 1,000 tiny suns. The calf, now dry and soft-furred, stood beside her mother, her legs steadier, though each step still carried the clumsy joy of newness. She sniffed the air, tasting scents that would become the map of her life: pine resin, distant water, the musk of the herd, and far away, the faint, sharp thread of wolf. The herd began to move when the sun cleared the ridge. Slowly, deliberately, they set their course toward the frozen marsh where reeds still held pockets of edible shoots. The mother kept her calf pressed to her side, the others adjusting their pace so the smallest among them would not be left behind. The young bull walked a little ahead, breaking a path through the snow. He glanced back now and then to see her following, ears pricked, eyes wide, a tiny puff of frost escaping her nostrils with each breath. By midday, clouds had drawn across the sun, softening the light until the world seemed made entirely of muted silver and pale gray. The calf had learned to step in the hoof prints of those ahead, conserving her strength. Occasionally, she stumbled, but a gentle nudge from her mother's muzzle kept her moving. When they reached the marsh, the older cows began to dig through snow to reach the chutes below, and the calf watched intently, then pawed clumsily at the snow herself, though she still depended on her mother's milk. The day passed in this quiet rhythm, feeding, resting, moving a little farther. The sky darkened early, the sun's light sinking into the snow as though swallowed by it. The herd settled for the night in a stand of spruce whose low branches shielded them from the wind. The calf lay curled against her mother's flank, the steady thump of the cow's heartbeat her lullaby. That night she dreamed her first dreams, not of running or rutting or the sweep of antlers in autumn light, but of warmth, of the smell of milk, of the soft sound of hooves moving in snow, all around her and always close. And in that dream, the frostlight of her birth still lingered, painting the whole world in silver. She would grow, and seasons would turn, and the land would change. But somewhere in her bones, the cold brightness of that first night would remain, a memory older than fear, older than hunger, older even than the promise of antlers to come. The snow did not vanish all at once. It loosened its grip in fragments, as though unwilling to surrender entirely. First came the rivulets, thin as threads of glass, whispering their way down from the hills. Then the shallow pools, spreading across the hollows, their surfaces tremoring under the restless push of meltwater. And at last, the earth began to show itself again. Dark, rich, breathing a scent so deep the calf could not help but lower her muzzle to inhale it, as though it were some great and ancient wisdom. She was taller now, her legs no longer trembling with every step. Her coat had shed its downy softness for a sleeker, richer brown, glinting with copper in the light. The herd moved more often, drawn onward by a restlessness that came with the lengthening days. The air felt lighter, warmer, alive with the hum of wings and the buzzing of unseen things in the grass. Every sound seemed new to her, though the older elk walked through it as if it were the most ordinary music in the world. By the time summer unfurled fully, the plain had transformed. Grass rose high enough to brush her flanks, swaying in slow, tidal movements beneath the wind. Clusters of wildflowers bloomed in delicate blues and yellows, their petals trembling under the weight of bees. The sky, freed of winter's tight hold, stretched vast and fearless overhead, a great dome of unbroken blue. The calf, though already on the edge of leaving that name behind, found a joy in running that no winter could have taught her. She would break from the herd's steady pace to race alongside the wind, legs unfolding in smooth, bounding strides. The ground seemed to carry her, each step flowing into the next without thought. Sometimes the yearling, now crowned with velvet-covered nubs, would chase her, lowering his head in mock challenge, and they would weave between the swaying grass until breath came in hot bursts and their flanks shone with sweat. The older cows grazed without lifting their heads, though now and then one would give a deep, rolling grunt of warning if the young ones ventured too far. The patriarch walked with measured calm, his pace dictating the quiet rhythm of the herd. Even the young bull, no longer an outsider but not yet a leader, had grown into the pattern, his watchful eyes scanning the horizon while his muzzle cropped the sweetest shoots. Summer brought more than grass. The shallow streams ran clear and cool, their banks thick with reeds and mint. Insects gathered there in clouds, darting and shimmering, and waterbirds lifted in sudden bursts of white and gray, their calls sharp against the warm air. The calf learned to drink deeply, letting the water pool on her tongue before swallowing, savoring the faint metallic taste that came from stone and soil. She discovered the pleasure of standing in the shallows on hot afternoons, feeling the current swirl around her legs. Yet, even in abundance, the plain taught its lessons. One evening, as the sun burned low and red along the rim of the west, the wind shifted. The scent came first, sharp, dry, edged with hunger. Wolves. The herd's heads rose as one, ears pivoting, bodies still but alert. The calf felt her heart drum against her ribs. She pressed close to her mother's flank, guided by instinct more than thought. The old bull's low, vibrating call moved through them like a thread, pulling them into motion. They did not run, not yet, but their steps lengthened, their bodies aligning into a formation that kept the calves near the center. The wolves never showed themselves, and by nightfall the scent had thinned into nothing. Still, the calf understood something new, that the grasslands, for all their beauty, were never only gentle. There were shadows in the tall grass as well as sunlight, silence as well as song. Days rolled onward, the sky a turning wheel of sunrises and sunsets. The calf grew faster, her body thickening with new muscle. She learned to strip leaves from willow branches and to nose aside taller stems to find the sweetest grass beneath. she discovered that the wind could carry stories. The faint musk of distant herds, the rich scent of rain still a day away, the sudden alarm that meant a predator was near. Once, during a morning grazing, the clouds that had gathered in the east began to climb higher, darkening until the light itself seemed to drain from the plain. The first crack of thunder startled her so badly she leapt sideways, her legs tangling in the grass. The older elk moved calmly, unhurried, even as the wind quickened and the air filled with the electric scent of storm. When the rain came, it came hard, sharp, stinging drops that soaked her coat in moments. But beneath the drumming of water she heard the deep, steady breaths of the herd, and her fear melted into a strange exhilaration. The storm was not an enemy. It was part of the grassland's voice, as real as wind and sun. By midsummer, the calf had learned the shape of her world, the rise of the hills to the west, where the wind sang in strange tones, the open basin to the north where the grass bent like waves, the marsh to the east where frogs sang at dusk. She began to know the herd's routes by memory, their movements tuned to the ripening of seed heads, the clearing of streams, the shifting patterns of shade and heat. And always, there was the running. On days when the sky was an endless sweep of blue, and the air held only the faintest breeze, she would feel the urge rise in her without warning. She would break into a gallop, the grass parting before her, the earth springing back beneath each hoof. She would not stop until her breath came ragged and the horizon swam in heat. Then she would stand still, feeling the sweat cool on her hide, her sides heaving, her ears flicking to catch the small, contented noises of the grassland. That summer would be the measure against which all others were weighed. She would not know it until later, but every warm scent of clover, every ripple of wind over the hills, every soft call of the herd settling in the evening would settle into her bones. Even when winters returned and the grass lay hidden under snow, she would carry that summer with her, sunlight stored in memory, ready to be recalled in the long, cold nights. And as the days began their slow tilt toward autumn, the first subtle change whispered through the grass. It began so quietly that she did not notice it at first. The days were still warm, the grass still deep, the air still filled with the soft drone of bees and the rustling of wings among the tall seed heads. The herd moved in their slow rhythm between the feeding grounds and the shallow lakes, their paths as familiar now as the sound of their own breath. But within her body, a change had started. Small, insistent, unshakable. At first, it was nothing more than a faint itch above her brow, a pressure she would try to ease by rubbing her head against the rough bark of birch or the knotted stems of willow. Then came the heat, not of fever, but of something waking beneath the skin. The older cows glanced at her from time to time with a knowing patience, though they said nothing in their silent language. The young bulls, their own crowns already forming in plush arcs, would pass her with a certain flick of the ears, an acknowledgment that she had stepped into a season of her own. The mornings began to carry the scent of ripening seed and distant rain. The wind lost some of its summer softness, carrying now a cleaner, cooler edge that hinted at the turning of the year. One dawn, as the light spilled across the plain in a wide, pale wash, she felt the change more sharply than ever. The skin above her brow was taut, stretched over a swelling that seemed to pulse faintly with her heartbeat. She shook her head, and the world wavered, the weight not yet visible, but already there. Within days, it broke through, two small buds pushing upward, wrapped in skin that was not quite skin at all. Velvet. She could feel its nap beneath her own tentative touch, warm and almost tender to the point of ache. It was a living thing, fed by the blood that surged beneath it, growing in a way she could neither control nor resist. The sensation was strange, but not unwelcome. In the cool hours before sunrise, when the herd still lay resting in the hollow between two ridges, she would stand apart, feeling the wind brush over her new crown. It caught scents more keenly now, as if her senses themselves had sharpened with the change, and the world seemed subtly different. Edges clearer, shadows more textured, distances easier to judge. She found herself lifting her head higher, the tilt of her neck instinctively altered to bear this new adornment. By late summer, the buds had lengthened into soft, sweeping curves, their branching tips still rounded and sheathed in velvet. The weight was more noticeable now, but she carried it with an unthinking pride. Sometimes, in the shallow waters of the marsh, she would catch her reflection, distorted by ripples, fringed by reeds, and pause to watch herself. She did not yet see majesty there, but she saw a promise. The others seemed to recognize it as well. The young bulls no longer treated her entirely as one of the calves. When the herd grazed along the edge of the open meadow, they would move aside to let her take her place among them. The cows, too, gave her a little more space, no longer steering her away from the wider arcs of their foraging paths. And though she did not yet know it, these small allowances were the first steps toward a life in which she would walk not only with the herd, but among its leaders. Yet the velvet crown was not without its challenges. The itch deepened as the days shortened, an almost constant hum beneath the surface. She learned to rub against the trunks of spruce, the roughness easing the pressure if only for a moment. Insects, drawn to the warmth of the blood-rich velvet, would alight upon it, and she would toss her head sharply, sending them spinning into the air. At night, when she lay in the grass, she could feel the pulse within her antlers as clearly as her own heartbeat. One afternoon, while the herd rested in the dappled shade of a willow grove, the sky darkened with a sudden storm. Rain came in a quick, drumming burst, soaking the grass in moments. She stood still and let the water run over her, streaming down her crown in cool rivulets. It eased the ache, and for a while she closed her eyes and simply stood, feeling the life growing there. The turning of the season brought more than her own transformation. The grass began to fade from green to gold, and the wind carried the dry rattle of seeds instead of the lush rustle of summer growth. Flocks of birds gathered in restless clusters, their calls sharp with urgency. The days grew shorter, the sun's path lower, and deep within her something answered, an instinctive knowing that the time for display, for challenge, for the testing of her strength was drawing near. Her crown, now almost fully grown, was a thing of balance and grace. Each tine curved in its own arc, yet together they formed a shape that seemed destined to catch light. Still covered in velvet, they were as alive as the rest of her. Sensitive, tender, and not yet hardened into the bone that would endure the winter. She carried them carefully, mindful of branches and the jostling bodies of the herd. In the evenings, when the herd moved toward the marsh for water, she found herself walking near the front. The air at that hour was a cool wash of scents, damp earth, fading flowers, the faint musk of other elk drifting on the breeze. The light poured low and golden over the plain, catching in the fine nap of her antlers, so they glowed as if lit from within. She did not yet understand why her heart lifted at the sight of her own shadow stretching long and crowned across the grass. But she knew it mattered. As the first leaves began to fall from the birches, her velvet started to dry. It was a slow process, marked by an intensifying itch that no amount of rubbing could satisfy. The older bulls, already shedding their own velvet in long, dangling strips, looked strange and fierce, their bare antlers catching the light like polished stone. She watched them, feeling a flicker of what might have been anticipation, or perhaps only curiosity about the shape her own crown would soon take. One morning, before the sun had risen fully, she pressed her head against the low branch of a pine and felt the first tier of velvet give way. It was not painful, only strange, like the sudden shedding of a heavy cloak. The scent of it was sharp and wild, and it clung to her muzzle as she rubbed harder, stripping away more. By midday, thin ribbons hung from her tines, swaying with each step. The cows glanced at her, their eyes calm but assessing, as if marking this as a quiet rite of passage. She did not finish the shedding that day or the next. It took time and patience and the endless rubbing against trunks and stones. But with each strip that fell, the antlers beneath emerged, smooth, hard, and gleaming in the late summer light. They were no longer simply growing things, they were tools, symbols, and, though she did not yet know it, part of the language she would soon need to speak when the grass turned brittle and the air filled with the calls of the rut. For now, though, she walked with the herd across the golden plain, the sky above vast and turning. The wind was cooler, the nights longer, and somewhere deep in the bones of the land, autumn was gathering itself for its own display. Her crown, bare now, caught the sun like a net of fire. She felt its weight, its balance, and the way the world seemed to regard her a little differently for carrying it. The days ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. But as the first true chill of the coming season settled over the grasslands, she held her head high, her new crown gleaming against the horizon. And far to the north, on the wind's edge, came the first faint scent of change. The sun had shifted its gaze. It no longer climbed high to spill its warmth across the grasslands, but drifted lower in the sky, laying its light sideways over the world. That light was different now, less a fierce blaze, more a golden tide that poured slow and heavy through the air, drenching everything it touched in honey. The long stems of grass caught it first, their seed heads bending beneath its weight, each one a torch in the still breeze. The rivers caught it next, turning into molten pathways that wound away into the horizon. Even the birches, their leaves thinning with the season, seemed to drink the glow, holding it for a moment before letting it fall in small, trembling pieces to the ground. For her, autumn was not just a shift in light, it was a shift in the world's very heartbeat. The ground felt firmer beneath her hooves, the sweet softness of summer grass giving way to a crispness that crunched when stepped upon. The air was clearer, sharper, carrying scents over greater distances. She could smell the musk of other elk herds far beyond the reach of sight, their calls rolling low across the plain in the deepening evenings. The wind brought the first taste of frost, not yet laid upon the land, but waiting just beyond the night. The herd moved differently now. They traveled with purpose, tracing paths older than memory, routes shaped by centuries of hooves and the pull of instinct. These were not the meandering wanderings of summer's ease, but deliberate crossings from feeding ground to feeding ground, each stop chosen with care. Water sources became the silent map of their migration, and the rivers, shining under the slanting sun, were both guide and giver. When they reached the great bend of the eastern river, the light broke upon it in 1,000 shifting shards. Salmon leapt against the current, their bodies flashing silver in the golden air before vanishing back into the depths. Waterbirds clustered at the edges, their long legs trailing ripples as they stepped through the shallows. The herd lingered there, drinking deeply, their reflections wavering in the light-struck water. She lowered her muzzle and tasted the cold clarity of it, the mineral tang a reminder that even in this time of beauty, the body must store strength for what lay ahead. Each evening, the rivers of autumn light deepened into a brilliance that seemed almost too rich to be real. The sky would flare in layers, rose, amber, a thin seam of green, before the first stars emerged. The clouds, slow-moving and heavy at this time of year, glowed from beneath as though lit by some vast fire beyond the horizon. The light would catch in her bare, polished antlers, making them blaze against the dusk. She would stand still then, the wind threading through the cooling air, and feel something rise inside her. Pride, perhaps, or simply the recognition that she was part of the season's grand display. It was also the season of restlessness. The young bulls began to test their strength against each other, locking antlers in slow, deliberate pushes that were less about victory and more about learning the measure of one another. She watched them, noting the way they shifted their weight, the way they braced their hooves against the earth, the way a contest could end with a nod rather than a blow. Though she did not join them, she understood now that her own crown was not merely for show. It was a language, a declaration, a promise of presence. Sometimes, while grazing near the edge of the river at dawn, she would see the other herds moving in the distance, dark shapes against the gilded grass, their breath visible in the morning chill. The sight stirred a deep recognition, as if she were seeing herself multiplied across the land. All of them, scattered though they were, followed the same unwritten script. Feed, move, drink, rest, and always press onward before the frost grew too deep. One late afternoon, the herd reached a narrow crossing where the river, shallow from summer's end, shimmered like molten glass over pale stones. The light struck at such an angle that every ripple caught fire, every splash sparked gold. She hesitated at the edge, watching the current curl around the rocks, the sound of it like low music. Then, with a step both cautious and sure, she waded in. The water swirled cold against her legs, and the river's steady pull pressed gently against her chest. For a moment, she stood in the center, the sun's reflection laying its warm weight upon her hide, while the chill of the current spoke of the season ahead. On the far bank, the grass was dry and sweet, its heads heavy with seed. She grazed slowly, each mouthful a gathering of energy. Around her, the herd spread out, their movements calm, unhurried. The old bull stood at the crest of the bank, the sun behind him, his silhouette crowned in gold. It struck her then that this mingling of strength and light was what autumn meant. It was not simply the slowing of the year, but the height of it. A last brilliant breath before the long quiet of winter. Nights came earlier now. Under the clear sky, the stars shone with a sharpness that summer's haze had softened. Lying in the grass, her breath silvering the air, she would watch them rise, one after another, until the sky was stitched with light. The rivers below mirrored them, the current bending the constellations into wavering shapes that seemed almost alive. Sometimes the calls of distant elk would carry through the dark, low and haunting, a reminder that the land was wide but shared, the paths many yet bound together by the same turning of the season. Each dawn, the rivers of autumn light returned, reshaping the land in their glow. And each dawn she rose with the herd, stepping once more into the ancient pattern, to follow the water, to follow the sun, to follow the slow, steady pull of the earth's own remembering. But far to the south, where the grasslands opened into forest, the first winds of a coming change were already gathering. The light, for all its beauty, was shifting still, and the season's song was not yet finished. The rivers of light faded first. They did not vanish all at once, but thinned day by day, as the sun's path lowered and its warmth became only a memory on the wind. The gold of the grasslands dulled into the pale straw of spent seed, and the wind, once rich with the scent of ripened earth, turned thin, metallic. carrying with it a distant bite that made the skin beneath her coat tighten. Each morning, frost lay heavier on the ground, clinging stubbornly to the edges of every reed and pebble, and each night the stars seemed closer, sharper, as though the air between had frozen clear. The herd's movement slowed. They no longer roamed in great arcs to follow the best grazing, but pressed on toward the sheltered basins and half-forested hollows where the wind was less cruel and water did not freeze entirely through. The pace was steady, deliberate. Hooves struck the earth with the sound of stone meeting stone, for the soil itself had hardened under the cold. The grass was brittle, snapping between her teeth instead of bending. She ate without haste, each mouthful measured. Hunger did not yet gnaw, but the quiet knowledge of its approach lived in the bones of every elk on the plain. One dawn, the frost did not melt. The weak light of day touched it, but it stayed locked, crystal bright, along the ground and on the fur of the herd. The rivers had slowed too, edges thick with ice that hummed faintly when the current pushed beneath. The herd drank in long, unbroken pulls, their breath curling upward in pale columns that drifted and dissolved into the pale sky. The wind was constant now, whispering through the grass like a voice without words. It carried scents far, but they were faint and few. The musk of a distant fox, the dry tang of lichen, the fading sweetness of buried roots. Once it brought the faintest shadow of wolf, and the herd tightened instinctively, their bodies forming a wall around the younger ones. The danger passed quickly, but the unease remained, following them like a second shadow over the snowless, frozen ground. When the first snow came, it came quietly. The sky was a smooth gray lid, and the flakes drifted down as if testing their welcome. She lifted her face to it, feeling the soft touch of each one against her muzzle, the faint melt as it touched her warmth. The ground brightened by slow degrees, the brown and gold of the grass retreating beneath a thin, clean sheet. The herd moved on, their hooves leaving a dark path that the wind began to blur even before the last elk had passed. In the deeper stillness of night, the cold sank harder. Lying close to her mother's flank, she felt the slow rhythm of breath, the heat trapped between their bodies. The old bull slept a short distance away, his head tucked low, the arch of his back ramed with frost. The young bull lay near the yearling, their muzzles pointed away from the wind. Above, the stars burned steady and fierce, and the moon, when it came, was a white coin pressed into the black. The land looked endless under that light, but it was a quiet endlessness, empty of all but the breath and heartbeat of the herd. By midwinter, snow lay deep in the hollows and swept into long, sinuous drifts across the open plain. Grazing became slower, harder. She learned to paw through the snow with firm, deliberate strokes, scraping away enough to reach the pale stalks and shriveled leaves beneath. Sometimes she found nothing but frozen earth, and would move on, her breath quickening from the effort. At other times, she uncovered a patch of sedge or the remains of a summer fern, and her jaw would work steadily until it was gone. The cold was not simply in the air, it was in her body now, a constant weight, an invisible layer beneath her skin. She felt it when she moved, the stiffness in her legs before the muscles warmed, the way her breath turned sharp in her chest after too much running. And yet the cold was also part of her now, woven into the rhythm of her days. It shaped her stride, measured her rest, honed her attention to every sound and scent. The river crossings grew treacherous. Ice formed in glassy sheets that looked solid but shivered under weight. The herd learned to read them. The faint music of cracks, the dark seams where water ran swift beneath. At one narrow crossing, She hesitated on the bank while the old bull stepped forward, testing the surface with his weight. The ice groaned but held, and one by one they crossed, hooves ringing softly on the frozen skin of the water. Midway across, she paused, catching her reflection. Pale muzzled now from the frost, her breath a silver plume that drifted away into the dim light. The days grew shorter still. Dawn was slow to arrive, dragging pale light across the horizon as though reluctant to open the day. Dusk fell quickly, swallowing the land in blue shadow before the sky had finished its brief golden arc. The herd rested more often now, conserving strength. She learned the discipline of stillness, how to stand for hours in the shelter of a low ridge, the wind combing the tips of her fur, her body warm only from the slow, steady burn of what she had stored. It was in this deep winter quiet that she began to understand the kind of endurance the land demanded. Strength was not in speed or size alone. It was in the patience to wait out the wind, the instinct to find the right hollow to lie in, the will to rise and move when the snow had crusted hard overnight. It was in the way the herd held together, their breaths rising and falling in a single, slow rhythm. And still, the cold deepened. The snow grew heavier, the rivers more silent. Even the wind seemed to tire, its voice thin and brittle. The land itself felt held in a long, suspended breath. Somewhere beneath the frozen ground, roots slept. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun's strength gathered itself for return. But here, now, winter lived not just around her, but within her, etched into muscle, bone, and memory. It would be many weeks before the first true thaw, and when it came, it would arrive with both relief and caution, for the season that followed would bring changes she could not yet see. The winter broke quietly, not with the sudden rush of warm winds, but with a slow unthreading of its grip. The snow did not vanish overnight. It thinned at the edges first, pulling back from the bases of stones, leaving dark crescents where earth dared to breathe again. Ice on the rivers cracked in long, resonant notes that rolled over the plains like distant drums. In the hollows, meltwater gathered into shallow pools, their surfaces trembling under the first hesitant breezes of the season. She felt the change before it was visible. The air, still cold, carried a softness now, as though the light itself had weight and warmth. The smells returned in fragments: damp soil, the faint sweetness of thawing moss, the green promise curled inside sleeping chutes. Her legs moved differently too. The stiffness that winter demanded began to fade, replaced by a surer, more fluid stride. With the thaw came hunger sharpened into urgency. The herd pawed and grazed from dawn to dusk, seeking the first shoots with a quiet ferocity. The snow still lay deep in the shaded places, but the open stretches of grassland showed patches of green, and it was there they fed longest. Every mouthful felt like a gift earned by the long months of stillness. Then, one morning, the call came, not from the sky or the wind, but from deep within her own chest. It began as a low hum, almost like the tremor of distant thunder. She had heard it before, in the voices of the older bulls when the autumn rut was at its height. But now, here in the early spring light, it rose unbidden in her own throat, a sound both strange and familiar. She stood still, feeling it vibrate through her ribs, as if the earth itself had answered. It was the bellow, the voice of presence, of arrival, of the living claim to space and season. It carried not aggression but a kind of declaration. I am here, I have endured, I will meet what comes. The sound startled the younger calves, who lifted their heads and blinked at her. The older cows regarded her with the calm of those who had heard such voices many times before. The young bulls, velvet beginning to stir again on their crowns, answered with low, testing rumbles of their own. As the days lengthened, the bellow became a part of the season's music. Across the plains, voices rose, some deep and rolling, others high and sharp, each shaped by the body that carried it. At dawn, the calls drifted through the mist that pooled in the lowlands. At dusk, they echoed across the rivers, mingling with the liquid songs of returning waterbirds. She learned when to call, when to listen, and when to let the silence stretch, so the next voice would carry farther. The land itself seemed to move with the bellows. Green spread quickly now, the first flowers daring to open beneath the shelter of sedge. The rivers ran high and cold, tumbling over stones loosened by the melt. Frogs sang in the marshes at night, their voices blending with the elk's deeper chorus until the air seemed thick with sound. Her own body responded to the season's rise. The crown she had carried through the winter felt heavier now, with the beginnings of new growth beneath the surface. She rubbed it against the trunks of birch, feeling the faint stir of blood in the velvet that would soon push upward. Her stride lengthened, her muscles tightened, and the weariness of the cold months was replaced by a restless strength. Sometimes, in the pale gold of early evening, she would climb a low rise and stand alone against the wind. From there, she could see the far lines of the horizon, the scattered, dark shapes of other herds moving in the distance. She would lift her head and bellow, feeling the sound travel out over the grass, over the rivers, perhaps even to those distant shapes she could not reach. And if an answering call came, deep, resonant, and far away, she would stand and listen until the echo faded into the hum of the wind. The calves born last year had grown bold in the softer air, chasing each other through the grass in twisting, lunging games. She remembered that joy from her own first spring, the way the earth felt alive beneath each leap. Yet there was a difference now. Her role in the herd had shifted, not fully leader, but no longer only a follower. Her voice in the spring chorus marked her as one to be noticed, to be remembered. The migration routes began to open again as the snow retreated from the high passes. The herd moved steadily, following the swell of green as it spread northward. Each day brought new scents: wet stone, budding willow, the faint musk of other elk passing hours before. The rivers they crossed were colder than any they had known in autumn, the water biting at their legs, but they crossed without hesitation, driven by the pull of instinct older than memory. On one such crossing, as she stepped from the shallows onto the grassy bank, she paused and shook her head, letting the water fly from her crown in bright arcs. The droplets caught the sunlight, scattering into tiny rainbows before they vanished. In that moment, with the river behind her and the open plain ahead, she felt the truth of the bellow in her chest, not merely sound, but belonging. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of the wind, another voice was calling back. Spring's fullness lingered, but there was a new thread in the weave of the season. Something thinner, quieter, harder to name. The grass still rippled green beneath the wind, the rivers still sang against their stony beds, and the air was rich with the scent of new growth. But here and there, the land's song felt interrupted. It was like a note held too long, trembling just before it breaks. She first sensed it in the way the birds fell silent too quickly. One morning, while grazing in the open, she noticed the meadowlarks lift suddenly from the sedge, wheeling high without their usual scatter of song. Their wings beat fast, sharp against the still air, and then they were gone, leaving the meadow strangely empty. The herd did not stop feeding, but the old bull raised his head, ears swiveling toward the direction the birds had fled. He stood that way for a long moment before lowering his muzzle again, but his bites were slower now, measured. The second sign came in the scent on the wind. It was faint, almost swallowed by the sweetness of flowering clover, but it threaded through, a dry, foreign smell, carrying something sharp and metallic beneath it. Not wolf, not bear, something else. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, but the wind shifted before she could catch it fully. The young bulls kept grazing, though one of them glanced up briefly. His ears pricked in a way that made her think he had noticed it too. Days passed, and the shadows lengthened. Not only the ones cast by the lowering sun, but the kind that moved even when the light did not change. Small things were missing from the meadow. The distant echo of crane calls, the scurrying rustle of voles in the grass, the silver thread of minnows in the shallows. She felt the absence in her bones, the way a pause in the herd's steady rhythm could be felt even if no one spoke of it. The herd's path took them northward, skirting the low marshes where reeds stood high and golden. In other springs the marsh had been a place of abundance. Sedge thick at the edges, frogs loud enough to fill the night with their chorus. This year, the edges were quieter. The frogs called in shorter bursts, as if unwilling to draw too much attention. The reeds themselves were thinned in patches, pressed down into unnatural shapes, as though something large had passed through and lingered there. It was not only the marsh. On the open grassland, they sometimes found patches where the ground was cut with deep impressions. Not hoofprints, not the rounded prints of paw or pad. Long, narrow marks, pressed with weight, trailing off in strange, meandering lines. The old bull would stand over them, sniffing, his eyes narrowing slightly before he moved on. No one spoke of them, but each time, the herd quickened their pace afterward. One evening, as the sun melted low into the horizon, the shadows came more directly. The herd was grazing near a slope where the grass was high and thick, the kind that swayed in great sheets when the wind turned. She was feeding quietly, the taste of young clover sharp and sweet on her tongue, when the wind shifted again. The scent was back, stronger now, not just sharp and metallic, but edged with something she did not know, something dry and burnt, like stone heated too quickly. Her head rose. The young bulls lifted theirs as well. The old bull gave a low, steady grunt, not of panic, but of warning, and the cows began to draw the calves closer. The herd did not run. They never ran without reason. But their formation tightened. The air felt heavy, as though the light itself had thickened. In the high grass ahead, something shifted. It was not wolf, not bear, taller, straighter, slower. The shape moved against the wind, its edges breaking the grass in a way that made no sound. She could not see it fully. Only the pale glint of something that caught the fading light, the slow, deliberate pace that was unlike any predator she knew. The old bull's head stayed high until the shadow melted back into the grass and was gone. When night fell, the herd moved to higher ground, where the open slopes gave them room to see in all directions. The stars came out in their slow, patient scatter, the moon rising pale and cold over the ridge. Still, sleep came lightly. Even in the stillness, she kept her ears half turned toward the wind, listening for the return of that scent, that shape. The next morning, they moved on without grazing much. The air was fresh again, the shadows hidden for now, but the herd's pace was quicker, their steps more deliberate. She stayed near the center, feeling the bodies on all sides, the quiet language of presence that meant safety. And yet, as the grass whispered against her legs, she could not shake the memory of that moving shape, how it had stood taller than the grass, how the wind had bent around it as though it did not belong here. The season still carried the sweetness of spring, but now, woven through it, was the knowledge that the open grass held more than wind and sunlight. Something else moved here, something that made the meadowlarks fall silent, that pressed the reeds into strange patterns, that walked where no hoof had walked before. And though the shadows were gone from sight, she knew they had not left the land. They were only waiting. The open plain awaited them like a great breath held by the earth itself, vast, unbroken, stretching so far that the horizon curved away before the eye could catch it. There were no ridges here to offer shelter, no clustered trees to break the wind, only an ocean of grass swaying under the weight of the sky. The air was so wide, so clear, that every sound carried: the rustle of stalks in the breeze, the hollow drumming of hooves, the faint whisper of feathers from a bird passing overhead. They stepped from the safety of the rolling hills at dawn, the sun just cresting the eastern edge of the world, spilling gold across the plain. Dew clung to every blade of grass, brushing cold against their legs and leaving a shining trail in their wake. The herd moved in a loose formation, cows with calves toward the center, the young bulls flanking, the old bull at the rear, his head high, watching the distance behind them. She found her place near the forward edge, her eyes scanning the far, rippling green where land met sky. The first day's travel was a quiet one. The plain seemed calm, and the shadow scent from earlier in the season had not returned. They grazed as they walked, pausing at shallow hollows where water glimmered like shards of sky. The calves played between the adults, darting forward in short bursts before falling back into the protection of the herd. Yet beneath the surface of their slow, steady movement was the unspoken truth. Here, in the open, there was no place to hide. The wind was constant, coming from the west, pushing against their flanks. It carried scents from far away: distant herds, the musk of bison, the faint mineral tang of drying riverbeds. She learned to read it as the older elk did, noting when it shifted, when it brought something sharper, something alive and moving far beyond sight. The plain demanded that kind of attention. It offered no warning but what the wind could tell. On the second day, the land changed subtly. The grass grew shorter, sparser, the soil beneath hard and pale. They moved faster here, the herd's pace evening out into the steady rhythm of migration. She felt the strength in her legs, the long, unhurried power that came from miles of endurance. Her crown of antlers caught the sun, casting shifting shadows across her back as she walked. The young bulls sometimes pulled ahead, testing their speed, but the old bull's slow, certain stride always brought them back into line. Midway through the plain, they crossed a dry riverbed, its banks sloped and crumbling. The earth there was pale as bone, streaked with the marks of past floods. She stepped carefully down one side, hooves sliding slightly in the loose soil, then climbed the other, feeling the sun's heat radiating from the bare ground. At the top, she paused. From here, she could see further than before, miles upon miles of grassland broken only by the faint shimmer of heat. And there, far to the south, a line of movement, small, distant, but unmistakable. The old bull joined her at the crest, his gaze following hers. He did not bellow, did not change the herd's pace, but his tail flicked once, deliberate. Whatever moved out there was too far to trouble them now, but it was a reminder that they were not alone in this wide country. The days blurred into one another. Sunrise, walking, grazing, rest. The plain's sameness was its own kind of beauty, its own kind of test. In the evenings, when they stopped to feed more heavily, the light stretched long and low, turning every shadow into a ribbon of dusk across the grass. She would stand and watch the horizon darken, the stars appearing in careful order until the sky was crowded with them. The wind cooled, and the grass whispered in 1,000 unseen voices. It was on the 4th day that the plain tested them. A windstorm rose from the west, sudden and fierce, flattening the grass and filling the air with a fine dust that stung the eyes. The herd closed ranks, calves pressed tight between the adults. She lowered her head, letting her antlers cut the wind, her eyes half shut against the grit. The world narrowed to the sound of hooves in unison, the warmth of bodies beside her, the feel of the ground steady beneath each step. The storm passed by evening, leaving the plain washed in a strange copper light. That night, under a pale and swollen moon, they reached the far edge of the plain. Here, the land began to rise again, folding into low ridges where willows clustered near trickling streams. The grass grew taller, softer, heavy with seed. The air smelled of water and shade. The herd slowed, and a deep collective sigh seemed to move through them. She drank from the stream until her thirst eased, the water cold and sweet on her tongue. When she lifted her head, droplets clung to her muzzle and reflected the moonlight in tiny flashes. Around her, the herd settled, some lying in the grass, others standing watch. The open plain lay behind them now, wide and endless, and though it had given them passage, it had also taken something. A little of their energy, a little of their certainty. But they had crossed it together, step for step, shadow for shadow. And in the days ahead, they would need that closeness, for the journey was far from over, and the shadows on the horizon had not vanished, only shifted. Far away, in the darkness beyond the ridges, a glint of movement caught the moonlight. The ridges offered a brief reprieve after the long crossing of the plain, but it was a reprieve with an edge. Here, the wind moved differently, curling between slopes in sudden bursts, carrying scents that shifted from one moment to the next. The grass was taller, yes, and the streams more frequent, but every pool of water mirrored the sky too perfectly, too still, as if watching for something. The herd moved slower now, not from weariness alone, but from caution. Their bodies strung with the quiet alertness that comes when the land feels less certain. It was here, in this uneasy calm, that she felt the first deep stirrings in her antlers again. They had carried her through the winter, polished and bare, the weight a familiar part of her. But now, with the tilt of the season and the lengthening days, she could feel the blood rising within them, feeding the last growth they would ever know. Velvet returned, not the tender buds of her youth, but a rich, thick sheath that covered the hard bone beneath, warm with life and strangely sensitive to the touch. The sensation was not unpleasant, though it hummed constantly in the background of her days. When she lowered her head to graze, she could feel the grass brushing against the velvet. When the wind shifted, the fine nap rippled softly, as though it too could sense the change in the air. Sometimes, when the sun slid low in the sky, she would stand on a ridge with the light pouring through the thin layer, making the blood within glow a deep, living red. It was a quiet kind of glory, meant not for battle, but for the slow claiming of space. Yet, this year, the herd was smaller. She had noticed it without meaning to count. Fewer shadows at dawn when they rose from their beds, fewer bodies in the mirrored pools when they stopped to drink. The calves from the spring had grown, but there were fewer of them than the year before. The old bull still led, but his steps were heavier now, his breath shorter on long climbs. The young bulls filled the spaces at the flanks, their crowns still covered in soft velvet, their movements sharp with a need to prove themselves. The streams here were fed by meltwater, their edges lined with reeds that whispered even when there was no wind. In the evenings, the light caught in those reeds, bending and breaking into gold shards that danced over the herd's legs. She would wade into the shallows, feeling the cold grip of the water against her skin, lowering her muzzle to drink. Droplets would cling to her crown, glinting like tiny beads before slipping down into the current. Each day, the velvet itched more. She rubbed it against the rough bark of willows, against the sun-warmed faces of rock. The friction was satisfying, the release slow and steady. Strips began to hang from the tines, dark and curling, carrying with them the scent of iron and the memory of the blood that had fed them. She would toss her head to shake them free, and they would drift to the ground like fallen leaves left behind without ceremony. The young bulls began sparring now, though the rut was still weeks away. Their antlers clashed with a hollow, muffled sound, the velvet absorbing the blows. It was not yet serious, just the testing of strength, the measuring of weight and stance. She watched them from a short distance, feeling the same restless energy in her own body, though her role was different. Her power was not in challenge, but in presence, in the quiet way her crown marked her as one who had endured and grown. Nights in the ridges were cooler, the stars sharp as flint. The air was thinner here, and the scents traveled differently, curling downward from the higher slopes. Some nights, the wind carried the faint cry of an animal she did not know, long and low, echoing off stone. The calves would shift uneasily at the sound, pressing closer to their mothers. The old bull would raise his head, listen, then lower it again without moving. By the time the last strips of velvet had fallen from her antlers, the grass was beginning to pale at the tips. The sun still warmed the ridges by day, but its heat did not linger, slipping away the moment it touched the horizon. The rivers ran lower now, the meltwater easing, the current calmer. She would stand in them longer, letting the cool pass through her legs, watching the sky's reflection ripple with each step. Her crown was bare again, but changed. The tines were thicker now, the curves sweeping wider, their points catching the light with a pale gleam. She felt their balance when she moved, the way they shaped her stride, the way they seemed to command space around her. When she walked through the herd, bodies shifted aside without thought, calves slipping behind their mothers to watch her pass. And yet, even with this fullness upon her, the air carried something uneasy. The scents on the wind were sharper now, more frequent, drifting in from directions they had not come before. Once, while grazing near a shallow bend in the stream, she caught the metallic tang she remembered from the spring, a shadow scent that made the muscles in her shoulders tighten. She lifted her head, scanning the ridge above, but saw only the wind moving through the grass. The herd would not linger here much longer. She could feel it in the way the old bull kept his head higher as they traveled, in the shorter pauses at the water, in the restless pacing of the young bulls at night. The ridges had given them rest and shade, but they had also gathered something else, something unseen, moving beneath the surface of the season. Her antlers were ready now, the velvet gone, the bone hardened. They were as they would be for the year, strong, sure, carrying the weight of both survival and warning. And ahead, just beyond the last fold of ridge, the land opened again into a wider world. A world that, this time, might not be as it had been. The first cool breath of autumn slid over the ridges like a shadow, subtle but undeniable. The sun's light still painted the land in gold during the day, but its warmth no longer reached as deep, vanishing quickly once the horizon swallowed it. The grass was turning pale at the edges, the seed heads bowing lower with each passing week. And in the air, woven between the scents of dry earth and ripening seed, was the unmistakable musk of the rut. In other years, the plains and ridges would have rung with it, bulls bellowing in deep, rolling notes that shivered through the grass, antlers clashing with the sound of hollow thunder. The air itself would have seemed to tremble under the weight of so many voices, so many displays of power. But this year, it was quieter. There were still calls, low, measured, distant, there were still the occasional bouts of sparring between younger bulls, their antlers locking and pushing in short bursts before breaking apart. Yet the great chorus was absent. The nights held long stretches of silence where once the sound would have rolled unbroken from one end of the plain to the other. She felt the difference keenly. Her own body responded to the turning season, the instinctive awareness that this was a time for claiming, for proving, for ensuring the future of the herd. But the herd itself was smaller now, and the old bull, still strong but slowed by years, rarely bellowed. The young bulls were growing, their crowns impressive, their bodies lean with the restlessness of youth. But they too seemed to hold back, their challenges shorter, less certain. The rut this year was more like a quiet dance than a battle. Movements were slower, more deliberate. Bulls circled one another in the open spaces, heads low, testing the air as much as each other. The contests ended quickly, often without the clashing of antlers at all, just a sidestep, a measured retreat, as though neither wished to waste energy without cause. In the cool hours before dawn, she sometimes walked to the edge of the herd's resting ground to listen. The world was vast and still, the stars sharp above her, the grass dark and heavy with dew. Somewhere far off, a single bellow would rise, deep and lonely, then fade into nothing. She would wait for the answering call, but more often than not, it did not come. Only the wind moved, whispering through the stems. The days passed in this muted rhythm. The herd moved through the lower valleys now, where the grass still held green near the streams. The air smelled faintly of frost in the mornings, and each breath rose like a ghost from their muzzles. The calves of spring were sturdy on their legs, grazing with confidence, though they stayed close to their mothers when the bulls came near. One evening, under a sky streaked with the pink and copper of a setting sun, two of the young bulls met in the open. She watched them from the edge of the herd, the light catching the pale gleam of their antlers. They lowered their heads, stepped forward, and locked tines with a muted crack. For long moments they pushed against each other, hooves sliding in the dry grass, muscles rippling beneath their hides. Then, with a sudden shift, one turned aside, breaking contact. The other held his ground for a moment, head high, before returning to the herd. There was no cheering chorus of bellows, no answering clash nearby. The contest ended as quietly as it had begun, the sound of grazing soon returning to fill the space between them. It was in these moments she began to understand that silence could be as telling as noise. The land was changing, though not always in ways the eye could see. The herds that once filled the plains in the rutting season were fewer now, their voices thinned across the distance. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of the night sky, in the way the wind carried fewer scents than before. And yet, for all its quiet, life still moved forward. Calves still nursed in the cool shade. Bulls still paced the edges of the herd, their breath steaming in the morning light. The grass still bent under the weight of dew, and the rivers still whispered against their banks. The season's purpose remained, even if its music had faded. When the first frost lay unbroken across the grass one morning, she stood and felt the sting of it in her nostrils, the crisp bite of the air in her lungs. Her antlers gleamed pale in the early light, their curves and tines etched against the soft wash of dawn. Around her, the herd began to rise, the old bull lifting his head to survey the valley ahead. The rut would end soon, quieter than it had begun, leaving only the memory of a season that once roared across the plains. And as the herd began to move, the frost crunching softly beneath their hooves, she felt the pull of the next chapter in the years-long turning. The silence would not last forever. Something always came after. The first real snow came late, but when it arrived, it fell without pause for 2 days and 2 nights. By the time the clouds broke, the ridges and valleys were buried in a quiet so deep it seemed to swallow sound entirely. The world was reduced to white and shadow, the dark line of a willow thicket, the black curve of a river bank, the pale mounds where stones or frozen tussocks lay hidden. The herd moved carefully now, their breath a steady rhythm of steam rising into the still air. Each step crunched with the weight of frozen crystals, the sound strangely loud against the surrounding silence. The calves of spring, now lean but strong, picked their way behind their mothers, learning to place each hoof where the snow was shallowest. The old bull led them through the narrow valley where the wind seldom reached, but even here the cold lived in every drift, pressing against their flanks like an unseen wall. Food was harder to find. The tall grasses of summer were long gone, and the pale stalks left behind lay hidden beneath the snow's hard crust. They pawed at it with deliberate strokes, uncovering what little remained. Dry sedge, brittle fern stems, the shriveled leaves of willow saplings. These meager mouthfuls gave enough to move forward, but not enough to replace what the cold took. Hunger became a quiet companion, pacing alongside them with each mile. Water was its own challenge. The streams were sealed beneath glassy sheets of ice, and the herd learned to seek the narrow bends where the current still spoke. They broke the ice with their hooves, lowering their muzzles to drink quickly before the cold could stiffen their legs. The water was sharp, biting, but it cleared the dust of hunger from their throats and kept them moving. The days were short now, dawn a slow bleed of pale light, dusk arriving almost before the sun had found its height. In the long nights, the snow reflected the moon so brightly it seemed as though the sky had lowered itself onto the land. The herd rested close together, their bodies making a single dark shape against the white. She could feel the warmth of others pressed to either side of her, the slow rise and fall of their breath, a reminder that they endured together. Sometimes the wind would come without warning, sweeping down from the higher ridges with a voice like tearing cloth. It would strip the loose snow from the slopes, hurling it across the valleys in swirling veils. The herd would hunker low in these moments, heads down, eyes half closed, waiting for the storm's temper to ease. When it did, the drifts would be reshaped, the paths they had made swallowed whole, and they would have to cut new ones with each hoof step. The old bull grew slower as the weeks passed. His stride, once long and certain, became shorter, and he lingered longer at each feeding patch. The young bulls began to take turns walking at the front, breaking the snow ahead for the others. She found herself there too sometimes, her legs aching with the effort, but her chest full with the knowledge that she could lead when needed. Yet, for all the hardship, there were moments of strange beauty in this long winter. At dawn, the frost on her muzzle caught the first rays of sunlight and glimmered like a crown of crystal. At midday, the ice on the river would sing in low tones when the current shifted beneath it. At night, the stars were so sharp they seemed almost to ring, and she would stand for long moments staring upward, feeling the great stillness of the world settle inside her. Time in the cold moved differently, slower, heavier. The herd no longer measured their days by distance, but by survival. Each morning they rose, each night they lay down together, still breathing. And as the weeks wore on, the hunger deepened, but so too did their quiet strength. The land was testing them, pressing against them from every side. Yet still they moved forward, step by deliberate step. It was in this rhythm, slow, steady, unbroken, that they would greet whatever waited for them when the snow began, at last, to melt. The snow had lost its shine. Where once each flake had been sharp as a crystal under the sun, the long winter had dulled it, pressing it into heavy drifts that no longer glittered but lay like blankets left too long in the cold. The wind still moved over it, whispering through the valleys and along the ridges, but its song was slower now, almost tired, as though even the air was waiting for something to change. She moved with that same slowing. Her legs still carried her, but they no longer stretched for distance. They sought only the next patch of sedge beneath the crusted snow, the next mouthful to quiet the hollow in her belly. The herd's pace had matched hers, not because they were weaker than before, though they were thinner now, but because in winter's deep there was no need to rush. Rushing burned what could not be replaced. The frost had seeped into everything. It lived in the edges of her ears, in the tips of her fur, in the narrow spaces between her ribs. Even her breath felt slower, each exhale rising in a pale cloud before drifting away into the still air. She did not fight the cold anymore. She wore it like another layer of skin, something that belonged to her as much as her antlers did. Some days the sun broke through the clouds, pouring a pale gold over the land. On those days, the snow softened just enough to release the scent of the earth beneath. She would stand still, head lifted, drinking in that smell, the promise of green, faint but real. The calves would stir then, kicking at the snow, chasing each other in short, breathless bursts, as if they too could feel the first whisper of something beyond the frost. But the warmth never stayed. By nightfall, the cold had returned, sealing the land back into its long, slow sleep. The old bull no longer walked at the head of the herd. He lingered toward the center now, his breath heavier, his steps shorter. Still, when the wind shifted, he was the first to lift his head, ears turning, nostrils flaring for scent. His presence was steady, like the shadow of a ridge that did not move no matter how the light changed. She stayed near him more often, not from weakness, but from something deeper, a knowing that in his pace was the truth of the season. One morning, the frost was so thick it looked as if the world had been carved from glass. Every reed, every twig, every blade of grass was edged in white, and when the first light touched it, the whole valley shimmered faintly, as if it were breathing in its sleep. The herd moved slowly through it, their hooves leaving dark prints in the glittering crust, their bodies steaming faintly against the cold. By midday, they had found a hollow where the snow was thinner. They fed quietly, the sound of tearing stalks and steady chewing blending with the faint hiss of wind over the ridge. She pawed at the snow until she reached the pale stubble of sedge, lowering her head to graze. Each mouthful was dry, but the act of eating warmed her enough to keep the chill from her bones. As the day faded, the herd settled into the hollow, bodies pressed close. The sky above was streaked with thin, icy clouds, the kind that caught the last of the sun and held it in pale ribbons. She lay with her legs tucked beneath her antlers resting lightly against the shoulder of the elk beside her. The warmth of the others seeped into her, slow and steady, until the cold was pushed back just enough for her to rest. The frost deepened as night came on, creeping silently over the snow, over the grass, over their sleeping forms. She felt it settle on her fur, a thin veil that did not melt. Her breathing slowed. The sound of the herd around her became a soft, distant hum, like water flowing far underground. Above, the stars were bright, their cold light falling over the land without weight. She closed her eyes and drifted toward a sleep that felt larger than rest, a sleep shaped like the season itself. Slow, quiet, patient. In it, there were no boundaries between herself and the frost, between the herd and the land. Everything was still. Everything was waiting. And somewhere far beneath the snow, the earth was waiting too, holding its breath for the moment it would wake again. The snow melted slowly, as if reluctant to leave the world it had claimed for so long. Each day the sun pressed a little harder, and each night the frost returned to whisper that winter had not truly gone. But the change could not be stopped. The rivers began to speak again, loosening their icy tongues, and the first shoots pushed through the thawed earth with a bravery that seemed almost reckless after such a long silence. The herd moved more freely now, their steps lighter as the ground softened under their hooves. Hunger still walked with them, but it was no longer a sharp, biting thing. It was fading, replaced by the quiet urgency to rebuild. She grazed on the first patches of green with slow, deliberate care, tasting the richness that had been absent for months. The calves, now yearlings, fed with a restless eagerness, their winter-thin frames already filling out in the new season's abundance. Yet the winter had left its mark. The old bull no longer walked among them. His absence was not sudden. It had come like the snow, gradual, silent, inevitable. In the final weeks of frost, he had begun to linger behind, lying down earlier in the evenings, rising later in the mornings. And then, one dawn, he had not risen at all. The herd had stood near him in the cold light, their breaths rising. Together, the silence holding them in a single unbroken thread. They had moved on, but the place where he had lain remained in her memory, an open patch beneath a ridge, touched by the first rays of the sun. The land took him, as it took all things, and the land would remember. She knew this in the way the wind sometimes carried scents from far away, remnants of seasons long past, of herds long gone. She knew it in the way the rivers still curved along ancient paths worn deep before her time. The earth kept every hoofprint, every shadow, every breath. It stored them in the roots of the grasses, in the stone's patient weight, in the soft, dark soil beneath the snow. As the days lengthened, the herd followed the river north, the way they always had. The air was filled with the songs of birds returned from distant places, their calls ringing bright against the steady murmur of the water. The sky stretched clean and blue, and the light fell over the land in a way that made it seem almost new, as though winter had been a long dream from which the world was only now waking. She carried her own memories into that light, the gold of autumn grass, the silence of the deep frost, the feel of her breath clouding in the still air of winter nights, the ache of hunger, the warmth of bodies pressed close, the sound of the old bull's bellow rolling across the plains. These were not just hers. They belonged to the land, to the wind, to the herd that had shaped her and been shaped by her in turn. One evening, as the sun slipped low and turned the river to fire, she stood apart for a moment, watching the current pull westward. She could see the sky reflected there, the clouds stretching long and thin as if they, too, were following the river's path. The water carried leaves from last autumn, twigs broken in the winter storms, and the faint shimmer of fish darting beneath the surface. All of it moved together, bound by the same steady flow. She lowered her head and drank, the cold bite of the river filling her mouth. When she lifted it again, droplets clung to her muzzle and fell back into the water, vanishing into the same current that had carried countless others before her. The land would remember this too, the sound of her drinking, the press of her hooves in the damp soil, the way her shadow stretched long over the grass in the fading light. The herd moved on as dusk deepened, their bodies quiet shapes against the darkening earth. The first stars blinked awake, faint at first, then steady, their light as constant as the turning of the seasons. She walked at the center, the rhythm of her steps matching the slow pulse of the land. Ahead lay new grass, new water, and the endless cycle of change. Behind lay all that had been, kept safe in the memory of the earth. The wind rose softly, carrying with it the sense of spring, of stone warmed by sun, of distant rain. It curled around her antlers, over her back, and into the open plain beyond. It carried no warning now, no shadow, only the quiet truth she had always known. Nothing was lost. Not truly. The land remembered.